Hello and welcome to another episode of the Halloween Podcast. I am your host, Lyle Perez, and today we're diving into the most mysterious and feared time of the day, the witching hour. Mostly accepted as the time between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. The witching hour has long been associated with the supernatural, a time when spirits are most active, when magic is at its peak, and when the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. But there's more to the witching hour than just ghost stories. It's steeped in history, folklore, and even terrifying real-life events. So if you're listening to this in the early hours of the morning, you might want to keep those lights on, because tonight, we're not just talking about ghost stories, we're exploring the historical events that occurred during this haunted time, and how the witching hour has embedded itself in our cultural consciousness, even making its way into some of the most terrifying films ever made. Before we dive into the stories, let's take a moment to understand the origins of the witching hour. The term witching hour was first coined in the 16th century, and it's believed to be a time when supernatural forces are at the most powerful. The concept is deeply rooted in Christian traditions, where 3 a.m. is seen as the inverse of 3 p.m., the time when Jesus Christ is believed to have died. This inversion has been linked to the idea that 3 a.m. is a time when demonic forces are particularly strong, and many believe that the number 3 is used to mock the Holy Trinity. Adding to this, folklore from various cultures around the world align with the belief that this hour is when the boundary between our world and the spirit world is at its weakest. In Japan, for example, 3 a.m. is considered the time when spirits are most likely to visit the living. In Western African traditions, it's believed that the spirits of ancestors are closest to the living during this hour. The universal fear of the early morning hours highlights how deeply ingrained the concept of the witching hour is in human consciousness. Modern psychology offers some insight into why the time of night feels so unsettling. At 3 a.m., our body temperature is at its lowest, blood pressure drops, and melatonin production peaks, creating a natural state of vulnerability. This is also the time when most people transition from deep sleep to lighter REM sleep, which can cause disorientation and amplify feelings of fear. Now let's take a look at some historical events where the witching hour played a key role. Our first stop takes us back to 1589, deep in the heart of the Germanic witch hunt, a time when fear of the supernatural led to some of the most brutal and infamous trials in history. One of the most horrifying cases was that of Peter Stump, a wealthy farmer in Bedburg, Germany. Stump was accused not just of witchcraft, but of being a werewolf. The legend says that he confessed, under extreme torture, to making a pact with the devil, which allowed him to transform into a wolf and satisfy his bloodlust. But what's most eerie is how the witching hour played into Stump's story. He claimed that between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., he would take the form of a wolf and hunt through the woods, targeting anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. Local villagers reported hearing howling of wolves during this time, and seeing strange lights in the sky, which they believed were omens to Stump's demonic activities. Stump's trial was a public spectacle, held at dawn, just after the witching hour had passed. The fear in the air was visible, with many believing that the devil himself might appear to defend his servant. Stump was executed in one of the most gruesome ways imaginable. His body was broken on the wheel, beheaded, and his remains burned. This case left a lasting fear of the witching hour in the region, and Bedburg remains haunted by this dark chapter of history. The idea of the witching hour as a time of transformation and terror can also be seen in many horror films. Movies like The Exorcism of Emily Rose use 3 a.m. as a pivotal moment where demonic forces reveal themselves. In this film, which is based on the true story of Annalise Michel, Emily Rose experiences terrifying events every night at 3 a.m., leading her to believe that she is possessed by demons. This idea of 3 a.m. as the time when demons and spirits are most powerful has its roots in the historical and religious beliefs we just discussed. Let's move on to one of America's most infamous episodes, the Salem Witch Trials of 1692. The trials took place during a time of extreme religious fever and paranoia, where any unusual behavior could lead to accusations of witchcraft. During the trials, several of the so-called afflicted girls claimed they were tormented by the spirits of the accused witches, often during the witching hour. One of the most chilling incidences occurred in the home of Reverend Samuel Perez, whose daughter Betty and niece Abigail Williams were among the first to exhibit signs of affliction. According to some records I was able to find, the girls would often wake up screaming in the middle of the night, some believe around 3 a.m., claiming to see the specters of witches standing over their beds. These nightly terrors were used as evidence against the accused, reinforcing the belief that these women were in league with the devil, using the witching hour to torment the innocent. But the horror didn't end with the executions. After the trial, Salem became a hotbed of ghost stories, many which involve sightings of the spirits of those wrongfully accused. The witching hour is still regarded as the most active time for paranormal activity in Salem, with many ghost tours reporting strange occurrences between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. It's no surprise that the Salem witch trials have inspired countless horror stories and films, including The Lords of Salem, which taps into the lingering darkness that still haunts the town. Now let's fast forward to 1849, to the final, mysterious days of one of America's greatest writers, Edgar Allan Poe. Poe was found delirious on the streets of Baltimore on October 3rd and was taken to the Washington College Hospital, where he spent the next few days in and out of consciousness. Witnesses reported that during the witching hour, Poe would become increasingly agitated, as if tormented by visitors only he could see. Poe's fascination with death and the macabre is well known, and it seems that these themes consumed him during his final hours. According to the attending physician, Poe's last coherent words were whispered around 3 a.m. on October 7th, and they were, "Lord, help my poor soul." He died shortly after, leaving behind a mystery that has puzzled historians ever since. The cause of his death remains unknown, but some speculate that Poe may have been haunted by the very horrors he wrote about, with the witching hour playing a key role in his final moments. Poe's death has inspired numerous films and stories, where the witching hour is often depicted as the time when his spirit still lingers, seeking resolution or revenge. Movies like The Raven and Stonehurst Asylum draw on the eerie themes of Poe's life and death, using the witching hour as a narrative device to enhance the sense of dread. It's also worth noting that Poe's work itself often delve into themes of death and the supernatural, which might explain why the witching hour is so frequently associated with his life and legacy. Whether it's the haunting poem The Raven or the unsettling short story The Telltale Heart, Poe's fascination with the eerie hour of the night has left a lasting impact on how we view this time. We gotta give it up to the master himself. Now let's turn our attention to one of the most haunted places in the world, the Tower of London. The tower has a dark history filled with executions, imprisonments, and betrayals. But did you know that some of the most terrifying events reported at the tower have taken place during the witching hour? One of the most famous hauntings involves the ghost of Anne Boleyn, the ill-fated wife of King Henry VIII. Anne was executed in 1536, and since then, her spirit has been seen wandering the tower, mostly near the site of her execution. But it's during the witching hour that her ghost is most active. Guards and visitors alike have reported seeing a headless figure dressed in white, carrying a severed head as she walks through the corridors. Another chilling story involves the princes in the tower, two young boys who were imprisoned and later disappeared, presumed murdered. These spirits are said to haunt the Bloody Tower, where their ghostly cries are often heard during the early morning hours. These tales of the witching hour at the Tower of London have inspired countless ghost stories and films, such as The Tower of London and Anne of the Thousand Days. That film explores the dark legacy of this historic site. But why is the witching hour so often associated with places like the Tower of London? Part of it has to do with the natural rhythm of the human body. Like I mentioned before, at 3 a.m., our body temperature is at its lowest, blood pressure drops, and melatonin production is at its peak, all of which can make us susceptible to feelings of fear and anxiety. Additionally, it's during this hour that many paranormal investigators report heightened activity, believing that the boundary between our world and the spirits would be at its weakest. The concept of the witching hour has also been reinforced by numerous real-life events. One chilling example is the Amityville Horror, where Ronald Defoe Jr. murdered his family just after 3 a.m. in 1974. This event inspired the famous novel and film series, which depicted the witching hour as a time when demonic forces are most active. Maybe one day I will dedicate an entire episode to the Amityville Horror, but for right now, let's move on to something that's near and dear to all of the Halloween podcast fans' hearts, and that is old-time radio shows. I can't do an episode of The Witching Hour without noting that this eerie time of night has inspired early radio dramas, some of which have sadly been lost to time. One such show was a little-known series called The Witching Hour, which aired in the early 1930s. This series holds a special place in radio history, not just for its chilling content, but also because it featured the early works of Willis Cooper, a writer who would later become famous for some of the most terrifying radio shows ever produced, including Lights Out and Quiet Please, both of which we played here on the Halloween podcast on a sub-show called Lyle's Mystery Theater. The Witching Hour was broadcast on CBS starting in January 1932, but despite its potential, it only lasted for 7 episodes. It's speculated that the series may have been too intense for its early evening time slot of 5:30 p.m., a time when families were likely gathered for dinner. Imagine sitting down for a meal only to be startled by tales of vampires, voodoo rituals, and the living dead. Enough to make anyone lose their appetite and possibly their ability to sleep later that night. Hosted by a character named Dr. Stewart, who was described as a student of the supernatural, the show presented a variety of chilling stories, each one more terrifying than the last. Titles like The Vampire, Voodoo Drum, and The City of the Dead give us a glimpse into the kind of horror that Cooper was beginning to craft. Stories that would lay the groundwork for his later, most famous works. Unfortunately, this series was abruptly canceled just after a short run, perhaps due to its intensity and time slot. What makes The Witching Hour most intriguing is that it was likely one of the first radio series to explore horror in such a direct and unsettling way. And yet, it has largely been forgotten, with no known recording surviving to this day. All we have about this radio program comes from newspaper ads and a few moments in radio history books, which suggest that this series might have been ahead of its time in delivering the kind of chills that Willis Cooper would later perfect. If CBS had given The Witching Hour more time, or perhaps a more appropriate time slot, it might have found a larger audience and a longer life. But even in its brief existence, it set the stage for the golden age of radio horror that followed. It's a reminder of how powerful The Witching Hour can be, not just as a time of night, but as an inspiration for stories that haunt our imaginations long after the clock strikes 4. While it may be very unlikely that we'll ever hear the chilling tales that were told on The Witching Hour, we can still appreciate the legacy it left behind. A legacy that would bloom into some of the most terrifying radio dramas of the 20th century. It's a testament to the power of The Witching Hour, not just for frightening us, but to inspire creativity in the darkest corners of our minds. It's crazy to think about that something so small like a time of night can inspire so much. From the brutal trials of the past to the chilling stories that continue to haunt us today. Whether it's a spectral figure in the Tower of London, the eerie last words of Edgar Allan Poe, or the demonic manifestations in horror films, The Witching Hour remains a time shrouded in darkness and fear. So that's going to do it for this episode of the Halloween podcast. I hope you enjoyed this dive look into The Witching Hour. If you like episodes like this and you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing to the Halloween podcast wherever you get your podcasts at. Share this episode with all of your horror-loving friends. And if you have any questions, comments, or want to suggest anything for a future show, go ahead and send me an email, thehalloweenpodcast@gmail.com. If you want to support the Halloween podcast, you can go to our website, thehalloweenpodcast.com. We have a lot of cool podcast merch there. Everything is really cheap, and any sale, any orders go to help the Halloween podcast so we can continue production. We can continue all of those spine-chilling stories that you guys enjoy. And you could also interact with me if you go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/The Halloween Podcast. I post a lot of stuff there, a lot of content, a lot of stuff that just doesn't make it to the feed. And if, of course, I'm always there. So if you want to come say hi to me, come send me a message there too. And as of this recording, we are only 3 weeks away from West Tennessee Comic Con, where I will be at. I will have a booth there. If you're in West Tennessee, I think it's taking place in Jackson. So if you're close to Jackson, Tennessee, and you want something to do on September 7th, come on out, see me. I'll be there. I'll be handing out some stickers, some postcards, a lot of other cool merchandise for the Halloween podcast. So come say hi. So that's it, guys. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, I will see you later. Have a good night.